I didn't come back for answers. I came back for quiet. The cabin knows the difference. You can hear it in the way the boards breathe when you cross them, in the way the screen door sighs after it closes. Quiet has weight here. It gathers in corners, slides down the rafters, dips into the hollows of chairs, the way sleep sinks into a child's body after a long day. The river helps. It talks in a voice that isn't language, a rhythm that lives somewhere between a heartbeat and weather. When I stepped onto the porch at dusk, Cash trotted ahead, tail lifting, his white coat catching what was left of the light. He paused at the top step and looked back at me like he always does, asking a question with his eyes. Are we home, or are we visiting a memory pretending to be a house? I didn't answer out loud. I put my hand on his ruff and felt the warmth, the steady animal certainty. He made a small sound in his throat, one I feel more than hear. Then nudged open the door with the casual arrogance of someone who believes a place exists because he has decided to occupy it. Inside, the cabin smelled like cedar and old paper and a hint of the flour my grandmother used to dust over everything, even recipes that didn't require it. My breath came easier, like my ribs remembered how wide they are in rooms that hold no judgment. I set my bag on the table and reached for the pull chain above the sink. The single bulb woke with a sleepy glow. Dust motes turned in it like slow snow. A folded sheet of paper sat by the window where no one should have left it. I knew what it was before I picked it up, in the same way you know a thunderstorm is on its way before the clouds decide to darken. Pencil on rough paper. Confident lines. A lantern drawn at the river bend, today's date written under it in my grandmother's tidy hand. Cash woofed once, then put his paws on the sill and pressed his nose to the glass. His breath haloed a soft cloud. Beyond the yard, the path slipped into the trees, the way a ribbon slides into hair. The last of the evening kept a thin blue line along the horizon. The river's voice was a little louder than usual, as if it were speaking up for someone shy. I turned the page over, then back again, as if the drawing might explain itself from a different angle. It didn't. My grandmother has been dead long enough that her handwriting feels like a trick of light when I see it. A small kindness I don't deserve, and accept anyway. I held the paper a second longer, then went to the porch. Cash followed, nails ticking softly on wood. We stood there and listened. The world was a bowl of sound. A few insects persisted in the tall grass. Something small moved near the fence and decided against being seen. The river kept its untranslatable speech. I folded the drawing and slid it into the pocket of my jacket, with the same care you reserve for a photo you don't remember taking, but know is important. I guess we're going down there, I said. Cash wagged once, crisp and decisive. He likes when choices are simple. The path to the water is familiar to feet and forgetful to maps. It bends without angle, the way vines choose their own geometry. Branches leaned in and brushed my shoulders. The air cooled and thickened with the wet hush you get near low places. Cash trotted a pace ahead, turning now and then to make sure I was still behind him, the way he does when he senses the day is about to turn into a story. His ears tipped forward, then back, not in alarm, in attention. We reached the bend where the river widens and pretends to be a lake for a minute, before remembering its job. Sand keeps secrets there. It holds the day longer than the sun does. It holds the weight of what stepped and what waited, the way a book holds the shape of a pressed flower. Cash slowed and lowered his head. His tail became a metronome. He moved toward the water with the deliberation he uses when approaching babies and old men. The light was there, not a reflection, not a trick of dusk. A small lantern glow hovering above the slow curl of current, bright enough to have an edge, soft enough to feel like it had manners. It pulsed slightly, in and out, the way breathing looks if breath had decided to become visible. Cash stopped 3 feet from the water and sat. His posture was polite in a way I don't see often. He glanced at me, then back at the light, as if to say, "This is a guest." I moved closer until river smell filled my lungs. That smell is childhood and work, and 1,000 unimportant afternoons. The lantern held its place. No wick, no handle. Just the impression of a lantern being remembered by someone who loved lanterns once and couldn't bear to let them go. The pulsing steadied when I stopped. It didn't beckon. It didn't warn. It existed with a kind of patience that made me think of my grandmother's hands resting on the table while she waited for me to finish a sentence. Then I saw her. She wasn't there, and then she was. The way a person steps into light you didn't notice was failing. Long hair, a coat that belonged to the weather. A face with the kind of beauty that prefers to be overlooked and punishes you gently if you try. She didn't look at me first. She looked at Cash and smiled, and he answered with a small lift of his tail and a sound I could feel in my own chest. She stepped onto the sand without making a mark. I could see. She held something in her hand, a folded page. I didn't move. My body knew we were inside a moment that could break if I touched it wrong. She approached with the kind of careful confidence you use when offering a skittish animal your palm. Cash stood, took 2 steps, then stopped at her knee and tilted his head up like a knight, asking for instructions. She reached down, not quite touching his fur. His eyes half closed. It looked like relief passing between them. I forced myself to breathe. The page in her hand had the faint texture of paper that had spent time in a drawer with cedar shavings. She held it toward me. Our fingers didn't meet. The page was warm anyway. The drawing on it was the river bend, the lantern, Cash seated between us, and me 3 steps back, my mouth set in that stubborn line I try not to admit I inherited. Under the sketch, my grandmother's initials, small and certain. No date this time. No instruction. The day didn't need one. I raised my head and met the woman's eyes. Something like recognition slid sideways through me. Not memory. Something older and less obedient. She turned toward the tree line where a path I couldn't see became obvious once she moved in front of it. The lantern lifted off the water and followed her, the way a kite follows a child who knows exactly how to run. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The river kept talking for her, and Cash had already decided. We went after her. The path was a suggestion the forest agreed to. The kind of trail that appears when 2 deer make the same choice every evening for a season. Needles softer steps. Branches gave way like polite dancers. Cash drifted near the woman's side, just far enough to honor the difference between reverence and over-familiarity. The lantern floated at shoulder height, keeping its soft, insistent pulse. I thought, not for the first time, that some lights are alive. Not in the sense of veins and muscle, in the sense of intention. I recognized the clearing before I entered it. Recognition doesn't start in the eyes. It starts in the spine, in the tiny muscles that decide whether to shiver. A low bench slumped beside a shallow pool. A birch leaned as if listening, one pale arm stretched overhead. A blue ribbon, weather faded, tied to a branch like a boundary and a blessing. The air itself seemed curated, like a room someone keeps ready for a guest who doesn't write ahead. On the bench, another drawing waited under a flat river stone. The paper lifted a corner in a small breeze, as if showing me it still had edges. I slid it free. The same hand, the same confidence, the same unshowy tenderness for ordinary objects that makes them feel holy. In the drawing, a lantern hung from a carved hook on the bench arm. In the real clearing, no hook existed. I looked up anyway. The pool mirrored a lantern precisely where the drawing placed it, and for a risky second, the reflection looked more solid than the absent would. Cash trotted to the edge of the water and stared into it with an alert interest, dog save for holes that breathe in small fires. He lifted one paw, tested the wetness, then set it down again, satisfied by an answer I hadn't heard. The woman had stopped beside the birch. She watched me with the kind of neutrality that is never indifference. Naily smiles came and went at the corners of her mouth, the way light comes and goes through leaves. I felt him before I saw him. Not the way you feel danger and not the way you feel a loved one enter a room. Something between. Footfalls, translated by moss. The weight of a body the forest had decided to forgive. I turned and saw a man step into the clearing. He was older by a decade than the last time I remembered his face clearly, which is how time is supposed to work. His shoulders carried more history than muscle. His eyes were kinder than they used to be, and harder too, the way wither polishes stones. Cash bounded forward with a joy that gives away truth. He curled himself into the man's thigh and made a sound too unself-conscious to name. The man knelt and put his hand into all that white fur like he had been rehearsing the exact placement of his fingers for months. He looked at me after, and I watched recognition open in him like someone lifting a window. We stood there and let the world settle back around us. The woman watched with that almost smile, like she had guided a boat to shore and wanted to be sure it didn't slip away again. "It's been a long time," he said. His voice carried apology and arrival in equal measure. "It has," I said, because anything else would have pretended to be braver than the truth. He stood and reached inside his jacket. He brought out a leather-bound notebook the color of tea left to cool, its corners softened by a life of being needed. I knew it before he gave it to me. The cedar box smell lifted from it, the same smell that lives in the space between winter sweaters and secrets. My grandmother's journal. The one that disappeared the last hot summer, before she started disappearing too. The woman didn't move when the journal touched my fingers. She simply stepped a pace toward the pool, and the lantern lowered as if to greet its own reflection. Cash returned to my side and leaned his weight against my shin with an insistence that says he thinks I am about to fall, even if I don't know that yet. I opened the journal. The first page was not a story. It was a drawing. A woman kneeling by this pool with Cash beside her and a lantern hovering like a blessing. The pencil work was my grandmother's. The woman in the drawing was the woman at the birch. Underneath, in my grandmother's tidy letters, a single sentence waited: "When the second light finds her, follow her without fear." I didn't look up right away. I let the sentence settle into the room of my body, where instructions go when they're old enough to feel like memory. When I finally raised my eyes, the woman nodded, a movement so small it could have been mistake if it didn't feel like agreement. The man shifted his weight the way men do when they have more to give and are waiting to be asked. Cash sighed in that dramatic way that means he approves. I flipped the page. A loose sheet slid free and tumbled to the bench seat. I caught it without thinking. It wasn't a drawing. It was a letter. The salutation stopped me with the same kind of recognition that started this whole evening. "Dear Ilara," it said, in my grandmother's hand. The rest of the words did that thing her words do. They built a bridge you can walk across even if you are afraid of water. Bring her where the river splits into three. That is where truth returns. I looked at the woman and said the name aloud because names prefer to be spoken in air. Ilara. She smiled fully then. The lantern pulsed twice, steady and sure, like a yes translated into light. Cash stood. The man exhaled, relieved for reasons I would understand soon. The river, not visible from the clearing, made a sound like approval. "Tomorrow," the man said softly, as if answering a question I hadn't asked yet. The lantern lifted from the pool and turned toward a path that hadn't existed a minute earlier. Ilara stepped after it. Cash followed her like he had always been her dog. I tucked the journal under my arm and went where I was being led, the way you do when the night decides to be generous and the world is suddenly full of second lights. The path deepened as we walked, folding inward the way breaths fold into a quiet house after everyone has fallen asleep. Trees leaned over us like old relatives who remembered my grandmother better than I did, branches dipping low enough to brush my shoulders, as if reacquainting themselves with someone who used to run here in smaller shoes. Cash moved ahead in short arcs, not quite trotting, not quite scouting, but carrying himself with the kind of certainty that made me feel like I was the one following him, not the other way around. The air changed first. You can tell when the woods are keeping a secret, because the temperature drops just enough to raise the soft part of your wrist, the place your pulse sits close to the skin. The earth here was damp in a way it hadn't been a minute ago. The smell shifted from pine and dust to something deeper, darker, more mineral. Cash slowed, his paws pressing into moss that had no business being this thick, unless water had been talking to it for years. Ilara walked ahead with a calm that felt practiced. Not stiff, not ghost-like, just knowing. She didn't look back to see if we were following. She trusted the river's instructions, and apparently, she trusted me to obey them. The lantern drifted at her left shoulder, its glow moving with the steadiness of someone who had perfected patience long before I was born. The man stayed slightly behind me. I could hear him breathing, slow and controlled, the way people breathe when they are trying not to think about everything they don't know how to say. If he was nervous, he didn't show it. His presence made the path feel less narrow somehow, like he was giving the woods permission to make room for both of us. I felt him glance at me once or twice, the way people look at you when they're trying to gauge if you're okay without asking and risking breaking the fragile magic of the moment. "We're close," Ilara murmured, not turning around. Her voice didn't carry in the usual way. It moved through the air like part of the wind, or maybe like the wind borrowed her voice to make itself easier to understand. "How do you know?" the man asked quietly. She lifted her hand and pointed not forward, not down, but toward a patch of air where nothing seemed to be. At first I thought she was gesturing at nothing. Then the lantern's glow widened just a little, its edges trembling, and for a moment, I could see something like a shimmer. A ripple in the air where the light bent and then bent back, like it was adjusting to fit around something unseen. Cash froze, ears high, tail still. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He did something I'd never seen from him before. He took one step backward and pressed against my shin, not out of fear, but out of recognition. He knew that shimmer. Or maybe he knew what lived on the other side of it. Ilara stepped through it. Not around. Not under. Through. And the path opened wider. The world changed in a way my eyes didn't catch fast enough. The trees here grew farther apart, their trunks darker and smoother than those behind us. The ground dipped into a shallow bowl covered in soft ferns that rose and fell with the faintest breeze. The light was different too, as if someone had lowered the sky closer to the earth. I had this strange sensation that if I reached up, I could touch it with my fingertips. Cash shook once, releasing the tension in his shoulders, then trotted ahead again. His tail lifted, soft plumes swaying like a small banner declaring the path safe. The man exhaled beside me. "This doesn't look like the rest of the forest." "It isn't," Ilara said gently. She moved forward with the certainty of someone stepping onto a porch they've walked 1,000 times. She stopped near a large stone half buried in the earth, its surface covered in carvings too old to be accidental. They weren't letters. They weren't runes. They were shapes that resembled the flow of water, the curve of river bends seen from above, spirals that mimicked eddies forming around stones when the current slowed. "The river drew these," Ilara said, brushing her fingers over them. Her touch didn't disturb the moss growing in the carved grooves. "Long before any of us were born, the river," the man repeated, eyebrows knitting. "The river remembers everything," she said simply. "It holds what the world loses. Sometimes it holds too much. Sometimes it needs help." I opened my grandmother's journal again, the leather warm against my palm. The pages fluttered as if caught in the faintest breeze, but we stood in stillness. The drawings inside shifted in tone, their edges darkening, deepening, as if the ink had grown bold from proximity to something ancient. "Where exactly are we?" I asked. Ilara looked at me, not past me, not through me, but directly at me. "At the place your grandmother couldn't find," she said. "At the place she needed you to reach." She turned her head slightly, and the lantern drifted to her side, lifting a little higher as if preparing for something important. The light intensified, but not in brightness, more in presence. It seemed aware of the moment, of the weight of it. My skin prickled. Cash let out a soft, uncertain sound and walked toward a cluster of stones arranged in a rough circle. He sniffed one, then another, then sat right in the middle of them, tail curling around his paws. He looked up at me and blinked slowly. The man frowned. "Why is he sitting there?" Ilara answered before I could. Because he recognizes the keeper's seat. My breath caught. My grandmother, I whispered. Ilara nodded. Every keeper has had a dog. Every dog has known before the woman did. Okay, your grandmother's dog used to sit there too. I stepped closer. The circle felt warmer than the air around it. The stones hummed with a quiet vibration, almost like distant thunder or the echo of a heartbeat inside the earth. It's time, Ilara said softly. For what? The man asked. His voice was steady, but I could hear the fear tucked under the edges. Not fear for himself, fear for me. Ilara raised her hand and pointed toward the center of the clearing. The lantern drifted away from her and floated directly toward Cash, who didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't blink. He lifted his chin as if greeting an old friend, and the lantern responded, dipping low in front of him, the light brushing over his fur. His eyes softened, and for a moment, he looked older, wiser, like he'd lived this moment before in a life he couldn't speak about. Then the lantern rose again and hovered above the stones, as if marking a boundary. Or a beginning. The air shifted, brushing my cheeks with a cool breath that wasn't quite wind. Something stirred behind the trees. Not a movement, not a shape, a presence. Something that had been waiting. The man stepped closer to me. Do you feel that? I nodded. I do. What is it? He asked. Ilara answered in a whisper meant for the space between heartbeats. The boy. At first I thought the air had thickened with fog, but no, it thickened with memory. With the outline of someone stepping through the shimmer we had crossed. Someone young, someone half-lit, someone who had been held too long in a place between stories. I felt him before I saw him. A weight behind my ribs. A tug in the air around my shoulders. A breath that didn't belong to any of us. The lantern pulsed twice. Cash stood up slowly, tail low, body still, ears forward. Not afraid, not defensive, but reverent. Then the boy stepped fully into view. His outline flickered, but not like a glitch. More like a candle in a room full of drafts. His eyes were gray, but not cold. His face was soft with years that hadn't touched him physically, only spiritually. His clothes were simple, old-fashioned, worn with use and care. He held himself the way someone holds a truth they haven't had the courage to say out loud. He looked at me first. Not at Ilara, not at the man. Not at Cash. At me. And something inside my chest broke open, not in pain, but in recognition. In the way you recognize a voice you've never heard spoken, but have known your whole life. Ilara took a step back, giving him space. He knows why you're here, she whispered. He's been waiting. My fingers tightened around the journal. The boy's eyes softened. He lifted his hand not fully, just enough to acknowledge me. Enough to ask without words, will you hear what the river couldn't keep? The lantern brightened. The stones hummed. Cash moved closer to me, brushing my leg with steady pressure. The man placed his hand lightly on my back, and I nodded. Because even though I didn't know the whole story yet, something in me knew this. Whatever truth he carried, whatever memory he had lost, whatever pain the river had swallowed, I was here to bring it back. The boy stood only a few feet away, though distance worked differently around him. He wasn't far, and he wasn't close. He existed in a liminal stretch of air where reality had become flexible, like a thin veil lifted between two kinds of silence. His gray eyes held not fear, not confusion, but an earnestness so young it hurt. Not naive, just uncorrupted by the years he had been missing. I opened my mouth to ask something, his name, his story, his reason, but my voice caught before any sound escaped. Cash moved first, easing out from behind my legs with slow, deliberate steps. His tail lowered, his posture respectful, the way he approaches children or very old men or anything carrying the emotional weight of both. The boy looked down at Cash and tilted his head, like he was recognizing something from a long time ago. He reached out one trembling hand, not enough to touch, just enough to offer the possibility. Cash closed the gap gently, lifting his chin, the tip of his nose passing through the boy's palm like mist. The boy inhaled sharply, not in fear, but in surprise, At the sensation of contact that wasn't quite contact, Alara watched with her hand pressed lightly to her heart. Her expression held so many layers of regret, all that it made the air heavier around her. When she finally spoke, her voice was a thread woven into the quiet. He remembers kindness before he remembers pain. The man beside me shifted slightly, his fists instinctively clenching at the word pain. He didn't say anything, but I felt the way his silence narrowed around the boy like a shield. I tried again to speak, but the air between us resisted, thick and slow. It wasn't fear, it was reverence. I stepped forward anyway. Cash fell back behind my calf like a guard escorting a diplomat. "Hi," I finally whispered. It sounded embarrassingly small in the wide-open hush of the clearing. The boy raised his eyes to mine, and in that gaze, the world narrowed to the space between our breaths. He lifted his hand again, palm trembling slightly, and pointed toward the stone circle. Not at the stones themselves. At the center. The place Cash had chosen earlier. The place Alara had called the keeper's seat. I swallowed. "You want me to stand there?" The boy nodded once slowly, emphatically, like someone who had waited years to see this moment happen. The man placed a hand gently on my arm. "Are you sure?" he murmured. No, I wasn't sure. But I stepped forward anyway. Cash followed close, brushing against my leg with every slow stride, as if making sure I didn't slip between worlds without him. The lantern drifted above me, its glow softening until it became less light and more presence, hovering with the attentiveness of something sentient. When I stepped into the center of the stone circle, the temperature shifted 1 degree colder, then warmer, then neutral. My breath fogged in a way the air didn't justify. The stones hummed under my boots like distant machinery or the heartbeat of something enormous beneath the earth. The boy stepped to the edge of the circle and paused, his form blurring slightly around the edges, not vanishing, just flickering with the memory of being somewhere else for a very long time. His eyes were fixed on me, and in them I saw something fragile and terrible and beautiful all at once. Relief. Alara moved to stand opposite him. Her presence steadied the air, the way a lighthouse steadies a coastline. The man shifted to my right, his breathing shallow, but strong. Cash pressed himself into my left leg, making sure I was physically braced, even if emotionally I wasn't. The clearing quieted until even the river seemed to hush. "Tell her," Alara whispered gently. The boy's mouth opened, but no sound came. His lips shaped something like a word, but air didn't carry it. He froze, brow furrowing with frustration, then tried again and again, but each attempt dissolved into silence. "He can't," Alara said, stepping closer to him. "Not yet." "Why not?" the man asked behind me, his voice straining with protective instinct. "Because his truth is broken," she replied softly. "And broken truths can't speak. They can only be shown." The boy lowered his head, shame passing over his features like a shadow. I felt something twist inside me, an ache so sharp it didn't feel like mine alone. The heaviness in the air wasn't supernatural. It was heartbreak. "Alara," I whispered, "what happened to him?" She exhaled, long and slow, as if the answer weighed more than the question. "The river kept what it could," she murmured. "But rivers are not made to hold stories. Only keepers are, and I swallowed, understanding blooming like a bruise. "I'm supposed to hold his." Alara nodded. "You are the first new keeper in decades. Your grandmother chose you the moment she realized she wouldn't finish her work." "She never told me," I whispered. "She couldn't." Alara's voice softened. "You were a child, and children shouldn't carry the weight of the lost." Cash pressed closer to me, as if sensing the swell of grief I didn't fully understand yet. The boy lifted his face again. He stepped forward. One step, another. He stopped just at the boundary of the stones. His eyes held mine like a lifeline. Then he exhaled. Not physically, emotionally. And the clearing responded. The lantern flared. The stones pulsed. The ground vibrated softly beneath my feet. A wind rose not from above, but from below, like air escaping an old, sealed chamber. The leaves rustled in a circle around us, moving in a pattern that was too intentional to be breezed and too gentle to be forced. And then the images came. Not visions, not hallucinations, memories, his memories. They spilled into the air like ripples forming on water. Faint shapes at first, blurred silhouettes that sharpened as the lantern glow intensified. A boy running along the riverbank, laughter chasing his heels, sunlight dancing on the water, a lantern in his hand, the same shape, the same glow. A girl behind him, Alara, much younger, hair braided, cheeks flushed with joy. The clearing around us faded into the periphery, replaced by images so vivid it felt like stepping into a story rather than witnessing it. I felt my heart climb into my throat. Cash whined softly, ears pinned forward, as if watching a familiar ghost. The boy lived laughing turned on the riverbank. He waved the lantern overhead like he was lifting a trophy. Alara reached for him, scolding with affection. Their voices didn't reach my ears, but I felt their warmth, heard their tones in some emotional language older than sound. Then the light changed. The scene darkened. The sky shifted. The air grew colder. A storm, heavy rain, thunder rolling in like a warning. Alara grabbed his hand, trying to pull him home, but he pulled back. His laughter died. His face twisted with fear, and then behind him a figure emerged from the trees. Tall, angry, moving fast. Too fast. The man behind me inhaled sharply. Someone was chasing him. The memory sharpened. The man from the trees grabbed the boy's shirt, yanking him backward. The boy stumbled, slipped in the mud, caught himself, ran harder, and the man followed. I felt my heart hammer. He wasn't alone. The boy in front of me, half-formed, trembling, lowered his head as if bracing for impact. He wasn't, Alara whispered. The memory shifted again. The boy reached the ravine, rain pouring, earth slick, water roaring. He tried to cross the broken bridge. He hesitated. He looked back. The man lunged. A shove, a scream, a fall. Water swallowing everything in seconds. I felt the wind knocked out of me. The image dissolved, and the boy collapsed to his knees at the edge of the circle, shaking with silent sobs that never made it into sound. Cash ran to him immediately, pressing his forehead to where the boy's shoulder might be. The boy leaned into him, trembling, as if the weight of the memory had been too much for someone who hadn't spoken in decades. The man stepped forward, fists clenched. Who was that man? Alara opened her mouth, but the answer appeared before she could speak. The journal in my hand heated, and then, slowly, deliberately, letters burned themselves onto the page. Marlowe. I felt the earth tilt beneath me. The boy lifted his eyes, wet with grief that hadn't had a voice in years, and he looked at me not with hope, not with fear, but with the quiet desperation of someone asking the only question that mattered. Can you help me finish what the river couldn't? The moment the name Marlowe seared itself onto the page, the air in the clearing shifted. Not violently, not the way storms announce themselves, but in a slow, deliberate lowing, like the woods had bowed their head. Cash stepped back to my side and pressed his weight into my shin, steady but alert, sensing that the world around us had tightened its grip. The boy, Alara's brother, stayed on his knees a moment longer. His head bowed as if bracing against a memory he had spent decades drowning in. The lantern's light dimmed to a soft, trembling glow, more fragile than before, as if even it felt the weight of the name. Marlowe, the woodsman. The man who had chased him. The one who had shoved him. The one the river had hidden from the story because the truth had been too heavy to carry alone. The man beside me clenched his jaw, his voice emerging like a crack in stone. I knew of a Marlowe, a man who lived upriver, angry, quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't peace, the kind that grows teeth. Alara looked at him with a sorrow that felt old, but still sharp. He hurt many. My brother was the last. The boy flinched at her words, and Alara's face collapsed into regret. She knelt beside him but didn't touch. She held her hand close enough to offer comfort without crossing the boundary the river had woven around him. You were just a child, she whispered to him, her voice trembling. You didn't deserve the river. You didn't deserve the silence that followed. He lifted his head then, and the grief in his eyes was not a child's grief. It was the grief of someone who had watched time move without him. Someone who had lost the ability to speak because loss had filled every space where language should have been. My throat tightened. His gaze found mine again, steady but pleading. I didn't need words to understand what he was asking. Show me, I whispered, my voice barely audible. If you can't speak it, show me. The lantern responded before he did. Its flame flickered once, then rose taller, thinner, more focused. Light stretched outward in a fine line, like a thread being unwound from a spool. It reached toward the stones at my feet, lighting the carvings from within. Each spiral, each river curve, each quiet symbol glowed with pale gold warmth. The stones warmed under my boots. The boy's form steadied. And then slowly, like someone opening a long-sealed door, the clearing shifted again. Not into a memory this time. Into truth. A different kind of vision unfolded. Not a replay of events, but a deeper layer, the part the river had swallowed. The part that had no images, only sensation. The part that belonged not to the past, but to the wound itself. The boy inhaled painfully, and the moment his breath entered the cold air, the clearing filled with a coldness that didn't belong to the woods. My lungs tightened. My skin prickled. Cash pressed closer, tail low, his body aligned with mine in an instinctive protective lean. Then the emotions hit. Fear, sharp, raw, childlike. Fear of footsteps behind him. Fear of breath too close to his neck. Fear of not being believed. Fear of being alone. Then guilt, heavy as a stone, dragged underwater. Guilt for running. Guilt for letting go of Alara's hand. Guilt for dropping the lantern. Guilt for dying. And then pain. Not physically emotional. A pain so deep it had stretched into decades. The boy clutched his chest, his form flickering wildly, as if the truth being revealed was too heavy for him to hold alone. I stepped forward, instinct guiding me faster than thought. Hey, look at me, I whispered, sinking to my knees in front of him. You're not alone. We're here. You're not carrying this by yourself anymore. He looked up so slowly it felt like he was lifting his face through water. His eyes were different now, not just gray. Gray threaded with gold, like the lantern's glow had found a place inside them. His breath steadied. The coldness began to ease. The stones softened their glow. Alara wiped tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself, but grief and relief poured visibly across her expression. He's been holding that pain for so long. The river can muffle feelings, but it can't dissolve them. The man exhaled shakily. Nobody should have to carry something like that alone. No, I agreed softly. They shouldn't. The boy raised his hand again, palm open, not pointing, not asking, offering, a gesture of trust. A request for connection. I placed my hand near his, not touching, just close enough for our energies to recognize each other. Warmth bloomed between us, a quiet thread forming. Not magic, not ritual. Something older. Something deeply human. Alara watched us with a soft, heartbreak-stitched smile. He needs you to follow him now. Where? I asked, though I knew the answer before the lantern pulsed in confirmation. The place where his story broke, she whispered, and where yours begins. Cash barked once low. Cirrus then stood tall beside me, his posture firm and protective. The boy stood too, his form steadying as if courage was something the lantern breathed into him. He stepped backward toward the break in the trees, then turned and began to walk. His steps were slow and deliberate. Steps of someone about to face a truth they had spent a lifetime running from. We followed. The man fell into step behind me, close but not crowding. His presence felt like a wall of quiet strength. Cash trotted at my side, matching the boy's pace, ears forward, tail low. Alara stepped beside the lantern, her presence keeping the light stable. As we approached the edge of the clearing, I felt the air tighten, as though the forest itself had been holding its breath. When we passed through the tree line, the woods plunged into a deeper hush. Different from before. No wind, no insects, no birds, just the low, steady hum of the river far ahead. And something else. Something like memory. The boy stopped at a narrow ravine cut deep into the earth. My heart stuttered. The air here was colder, heavier, denser, like the space between worlds had thinned. "This is where he fell," the man murmured, voice hoarse. Ilara shook her head softly. "No, this is where he was pushed." The boy closed his eyes. His body trembled, and the ravine filled with new images. Not the chase, not the fear, not the fall. Something quieter, something worse. The moment between survival and surrender. The moment a child realizes the world is not fair. The moment he accepted he might not be heard. The boy whispered something then. Not with voice, with feeling. A whisper that brushed the inside of my mind like cold breath. "Help me finish the story." I swallowed back the lump, tightening my throat. "I will," I said quietly. "I promise." He opened his eyes, and the lantern flared. The trees leaned inward. The ravine hummed with the soft echo of a memory returning to the world. Ilara stepped back. The man placed his hand on my shoulder. Cash pressed against my leg, steady and sure. And I felt the weight settle into my hands, the weight of the boy's truth. The weight of my grandmother's unfinished promise. The weight of becoming the keeper. Now I just had to find the courage to lift it. We stood at the ravine's edge long enough for the shadows to shift and gather in ways that didn't match the faint moonlight leaking through the branches above. The boy didn't move. His small figure remained fixed, rigid with a grief that hadn't softened in decades. Cash kept his body pressed into my leg, but his eyes, those gentle brown eyes that seemed to know every shape of sadness, were on the boy. Something in my chest tightened. Maybe it was protectiveness. Maybe it was recognition. Maybe it was the beginning of understanding what my grandmother had intended for me to inherit, without breaking beneath the knowledge. Ilara stepped beside the boy, not touching him, never touching but offering her presence. The way you offer your hand to someone drowning just before they're ready to reach back. "This place holds more than a fall," she said quietly. My breath steadied. "What does it hold?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her face toward the ravine, letting her eyes move over the steep slope, the moss-darkened stones, the shape of the land that tilted downward to the water. As if reading the memory written into the earth grain by grain. "The river saved what it could," she murmured. "But stories get tangled when they're carried alone." The boy trembled at her words. His form flickered sharply this time, not with weakness, but with an emotion so raw it felt like static in the air. A buildup of things he had not been allowed to release. I took a small step forward, the journal still tucked beneath my arm. Its weight felt heavier now, as though the pages had learned something new and were rearranging themselves to hold it. The man behind me lowered his voice. "What are we supposed to do here?" Ilara exhaled slowly. "We listen." "To what?" I asked. "To him," she replied softly. "To the part of the story the river could not hold. To the moment his voice broke." The boy turned his head slightly, just enough to look at me. His eyes, gray threaded with gold, held something like relief, but also fear. Like he was standing at the doorway of his truth but couldn't force himself to cross it alone. "I'm here," I whispered. "You're not alone." His lips moved. No sound came. But the ravine answered. The air shifted, heavy and moist, carrying the faint scent of old rain, long dried, long forgotten by the world, but not by the earth beneath us. Leaves rustled in a pattern that wasn't wind. The stones beneath my feet warmed, pulses syncing with the boy's trembling breath. Then the memory rose, not as an image, not as a scene, but as a sensation dragging itself to the surface, like something buried alive, cold, sharp, metallic, fear with edges, fear in a child's bones. My knees weakened under the emotional weight of it. Cash let out a low, rumbling sound and stepped between me and the ravine as if trying to take the brunt of it himself. The man placed a steadying hand on my shoulder, grounding me without a word. The boy lifted his hand and pointed down into the shadows. I stepped closer to the edge. And once my toes touched the moss, the world shifted. A ghost of sound drifted through the clearing, a ragged breath, a muffled sob, a man's heavy footsteps on wet dirt. Not loud, not clear, but real enough that my skin prickled and the hairs on my arms rose. A child's whimper, cut short, sharp, swallowing itself in terror. My stomach dropped. "Oh God," the man behind me whispered. Alara closed her eyes. The lantern pulsed once, bright and pained. And then the truth broke open. The memory poured into the ravine like water reversing its flow. The boy Lara's brother running, feet slipping in mud, hands scraped bloody, voice hoarse from crying, breath catching in shallow bursts. Behind him, Marlowe, his steps heavy, his voice low, slurred with rage. A threat carried in every ounce of his anger. "Come here," Marlowe snarled in the half-formed memory. "You know what happens if you run." I flinched. Not because I heard the exact words, but because the feeling was unmistakable. The boy didn't run only from fear. He ran from inevitability. From a man who had hurt him before, and who planned to again. Tears burned the backs of my eyes. Alara steadied herself on a tree. The sorrow in her expression cracked something inside me. "He never told me," she whispered, voice trembling. "He never told me what Marlowe did. He tried to protect me from it." The boy looked at her, anguish flickering across his half-formed face. Guilt, grief, love heavier than breath. He had run to save himself, but he had also run to save her. The weight of that realization pressed down on the ravine like a storm cloud full of stones. I felt the tears slip down my cheeks before I realized I was crying. The boy lowered his eyes, his hands curled into fists. His form flickered violently, as if grief itself had become too much for him to contain. "No," I whispered, stepping forward instinctively. "Don't disappear. Don't go. I'm here. I promise I'm here." The flickering slowed. He inhaled a small, trembling breath. His eyes lifted again, and I saw something new there. Not fear. Not pain. Determination. He lifted his arm and pointed not down into the ravine, but across it toward a narrow path hidden beneath years of moss and fallen leaves. A path someone had taken. A path leading away from the scene of the fall. A path my grandmother never found. Alara's breath hitched behind me. "That's where Marlowe dragged him." I felt my lungs collapse. She nodded slowly, hand over her mouth, voice breaking. "He didn't fall right away. Marlowe dragged him first, hurt him before the river ever touched him." The boy's knees buckled, and his form dimmed, shimmering like a candle close to going out. Cash rushed forward and nudged him with his forehead, whining softly, his body warm and firm against the boy's wavering form. And incredibly, impossibly, this time the boy steadied. The flickering eased. Some of the gold returned to his eyes, pushing back the gray. "He's holding on," the man said, quietly in awe. I placed my hand over my heart because it felt like something inside me was trying to climb out. "What do you need now?" I whispered to the boy. He raised his hand again, but this time, he pointed directly at the journal tucked under my arm. I froze. "You want me to write it?" I said. He nodded once, painfully, slowly. "You want me to finish the story?" A soft pulse of light flickered through his chest, as if his soul recognized the truth being spoken. Alara stepped closer. Her voice was gentle but firm. "The river cannot return what it never had. The story was broken before it reached the water. Only a keeper can mend it." A shiver traveled through the stones beneath my feet. Something ancient and patient and watchful stirred in the air, listening. The man shifted beside me. "Can she really do that? Just write it down and fix what happened?" Alara shook her head. "Not fix it. Honor it. Restore the truth so he can be whole. The boy watched me with a pleading so quiet and human it nearly undid me. I don't know if I can, I whispered. What if I don't tell it right? What if Alara stepped close enough that I could see her eyes soften in a way that reminded me of my grandmother in her last coherent year? You don't have to get it perfect, she murmured. You only have to be honest. The river will do the rest. My breath shook. My fingers trembled. But I pulled the journal out from under my arm. The pages fluttered until they fell open to a blank, one crisp, waiting. Glowing faintly at the edges, as if the lantern's light had woven itself into the fibers. The boy reached toward it, not touching, just offering. A thread of warmth passed between us. Recognition, permission, hope. Tell me your story, I whispered. Raising the pencil, the boy lifted his chin. And with a steadiness that surprised all of us, he stepped into the circle of stones. The lantern pulsed above us like a heartbeat. Cash sat at my feet, tail sweeping the earth. Alara folded her hands together and bowed her head. The man drew closer, breath held tight, and I did the one thing my grandmother had prepared me for long before I knew how to understand it. I listened. The boy stepped into the circle with a slow, weighted grace, like someone approaching the center of a memory rather than a patch of earth. The lantern's glow rose with him, brightening but not blinding, adjusting itself with a kind of intelligence soft enough not to overwhelm him, strong enough to reveal what he had carried alone for so long. I knelt on the mossy ground, the journal open across my knees. The blank page glowed faintly in the lantern light, each fiber pulsing like a heartbeat. Cash settled at my side, his body leaning solidly into me, and when I placed my free hand on his back, I felt the warmth of him deep in my bones. He was calm, but alert. Watchful in that way animals become when the world doesn't behave according to the rules they've learned. The man stood slightly behind me, hands in his pockets, shoulders tense, jaw working. He didn't know what to do with his fear, so he held it quietly, like a stone hidden in a fist. Alara stood at the boy's left, her posture long and sad, as if she was preparing herself to witness something she wished she could have prevented but couldn't look away from. The boy, still flickering, still half-faded, lifted his head. His eyes met mine, and in that gaze, I understood something instinctively. He was trusting me with the one thing that had shaped the end of his life and the long absence after it. His truth, his story, his last moments. And the silence that had stretched across decades because no one had been there to hear him speak. I swallowed, lifted the pencil, and whispered, "I'm ready." The lantern pulsed once, bright and soft. The boy exhaled, and the world around us shifted. It didn't transform the way memories had earlier. This was different. This was not a vision imposed on me. It wasn't the river rewriting the air with images. This was feeling, raw, direct, immediate. A wave that moved from him to me with an honesty that nearly knocked me backward. Fear hit first. The sharp, breathless kind. The kind that claws up your throat and makes your body smaller, tighter, quicker. A child's fear of footsteps behind them. Of a shadow on a wall that doesn't belong to them. Of knowing you're not strong enough to stop what's coming. My lungs tightened. Cash pressed into me harder, whining softly, anchoring me. Then came the sound. But not through my ears, through memory. The river churning, swollen from rain. Branches cracking under heavy boots. A man's harsh breathing. The ragged, uneven gasps of a boy who'd run as far as his small legs would carry him. My pencil hovered over the page. The boy trembled. Alara's hands began to shake. The man exhaled a curse under his breath. Then the boy lifted his hand slow, unsure, and began to move it through the air. Tracing shapes that were not pictures but echoes of moments. A language made of gestures, of the body trying to speak when the voice refused to come. I watched, I listened, I translated. I began to write. He ran from the cabin steps toward the river trail, the storm already breaking the sky open above him. His lantern swung wildly in his hand, its flame bending with every jolt. He wasn't supposed to be out alone. Alara had begged him to wait. But fear has its own gravity, and it pulls hardest when you've been hurt before. The boy's shoulders hitched with a silent sob. I kept writing. Behind him, Marlowe stepped out of the trees. He wasn't drunk this time. He wasn't slurring threats. He was focused, sharp, moving with a quiet speed that didn't belong to someone who lived alone and angry. Something in him had settled into purpose, and that purpose was the boy. The lantern flickered once. Alara pressed her hand over her heart. The boy lifted both hands now, fingers trembling, tracing sharper movements, jerks and stops, like running, like stumbling, like turning back to see where the danger was. I understood. I wrote. He ran harder. His breath tore at his throat. His lungs felt too small. The storm swallowed his cries, turning the sound into something the trees couldn't understand. Rain made the mud soft, made his steps slip, made the world tilt beneath him. Cash let out a soft, anguished whine. The man knelt beside me, placing one hand on my back as if he sensed my spine weakening. I kept writing even as tears blurred the page. He reached the ravine. The bridge was half gone, the storm had snapped it like a twig. He could jump it if he was careful, if he was fast, if he was lucky. But he hesitated. He looked back. The boy's body shuddered, his form flickering like light on water. He didn't see Marlowe's face. He saw Marlowe's hands, and that was worse. The lantern brightened. Alara sobbed softly. The man beside me tightened his grip on my shoulder. The boy stepped closer to me, his feet barely disturbing the moss. He lifted his hands again and pressed them to his chest. I mimicked the gesture with my free hand, feeling a cold echo where his warmth should have been. And I continued writing. He tried to jump. He didn't make it. But he didn't fall because he slipped. He fell because Marlowe grabbed his shirt and pushed. The moment I wrote the word pushed, the lantern flared violently, its flame stretching upward, turning gold white and sharp. Cash barked once, tail stiff. The ground trembled beneath us, not with physical movement, but with emotional weight or release. A confession, a truth finally given air. The boy's form brightened around the edges, his body trembling with relief so intense it bordered on pain. His mouth opened with a choked gasp, the first sound he had made. A sharp, broken inhale. I dropped the pencil. The man steadied me. Alara fell to her knees, tears streaming. He's remembering, she whispered, voice shaking. He's finally remembering. But this wasn't the end. This was the break. The boy raised his hands again, but this time, instead of reenacting the fall, he traced a slow, deliberate movement across his torso. A line, a cut, a mark. The truth that went even deeper, and the lantern dimmed to a somber glow. What is he showing? The man asked, voice low. Alara looked up at me with devastation in her eyes. Pain that didn't come from the fall. Silence swallowed the clearing. My chest tightened. The boy lifted his shirt, or rather, the gesture of it, his form turning translucent. And on his side, faint but visible, was a bruise. Deep, old, the shape unmistakable. A man's hand. Alara sobbed. The man cursed under his breath. Cash pressed himself against me so firmly I lost balance. I picked up the pencil with shaking fingers. I wrote, he didn't run just because Marlowe chased him. He ran because Marlowe hurt him long before the storm, because he knew the woods, because he knew the river, because he knew Alara wouldn't be safe if he stayed. The boy looked at me with grief, with sorrow, with relief, and with a small, glimmering hope. Because now it was written, acknowledged, seen, and the river could carry truth again. Alara reached out, not touching him but hovering her hand near his cheek. You never failed me, she whispered. You never had to protect me. I should have protected you. The boy's form steadied. The flickering eased. The gold in his eyes brightened with a warmth I hadn't seen before. He stepped closer to me. Cash stayed glued to my side, but his tail wagged one soft, slow, reassuring. The boy pointed to the journal again. I understood. I turned the page, and he prepared to show me the part that came after the fall. The part my grandmother never saw. The part only he remembered. The part that would finish the story and let him rest. The boy's form steadied slightly as he stood inside the stone circle. The lantern hovering just above him, its glow now thin and precise, like a guiding blade of light. The trees around us leaned inward as though listening. Even the river in the distance seemed to soften its voice, lowering its tone in anticipation. This part of the story mattered differently. I could feel it in the way the air thickened, in the way the moss under my knees grew warm, in the way Cash shifted beside me, ears angled forward, body alert but calm. Show me what happened after, I whispered, the pencil hovering above the blank page. The boy placed both hands over his chest and closed his eyes. His breath came in shallow, trembling pulls. The lantern dimmed to a softer, almost meditative glow, as if preparing the space for something sacred or fragile. Slowly, he stepped backward, out of the center of the circle, to the very edge where the stones met the soft soil. His form flickered more gently this demand, then the air behind him bent, revealing the faint outline of the ravine again. But this time, the memory didn't pull us into the fall. It pulled us into what came after. A cold breath of wind rippled through the clearing. The man at my side muttered, "It's starting again." But I could hear the break in his voice, the strain of watching a child relive the last moments of his life. I steadied my breath. Cash nudged my ribs with his nose, grounding me in that way he always does when he senses my fear rising too fast. The boy lifted his arms slow, shaken, and pressed his palms outward as if pushing through water. The ravine darkened further. The sound of rushing water grew louder, surrounding us, swallowing the edges of the clearing until I could barely hear my own heartbeat. Then the memory unfolded, not as an image this time, as a sensation, a pulse, a drifting, the cold, not the sharp, stinging cold of falling into winter water. A deeper cold, the cold that sinks inside your bones and quiets everything it touches. The boy shuddered once, twice, his form flickering like a candle on the edge of its last breath. I felt a mirror of that cold settle into my chest, not physically painful, but heavy, like grief wearing a wet coat. "He survived the fall," Alara whispered, voice cracking. "He didn't die when he hit the water." The man swore under his breath, fists tightening at his sides. The boy stepped farther back, into the space where the memory was thickest. The lantern followed, hovering above him like a watchful guardian. I raised the pencil again, letting instinct guide my words. He sank into the river. Not fast, not violently. The water held him with a strange tenderness, cold, yes, but gentle. He reached for air. He reached for light. But the current carried him. The boy's chest lifted in a shallow mimicry of breath. Cash whimpered and pressed his forehead into my thigh. I kept writing. He tried to call for Alara, but the water swallowed the sound. He tried to grab a branch, but the current spun him. He tried to swim, but fear had taken too much of his strength. The boy raised one hand and traced a shaking line through the air, curved, chaotic, spiraling downward. The river's path. The lantern dimmed, then brightened, then dimmed again, in steady rhythm, matching the boy's breaths. Alara wiped her face with the sleeve of her dress. He must have been terrified. The boy shook his head sharply. We froze. His eyes, gray threaded with gold, looked directly at her and softened with something that made my throat close. Not terror, not regret. Love. He had been scared for her. My chest tightened. I steadied the pencil. He thought of his sister. He thought of her crying. He thought of her running to the riverbank. He thought of her alone in the cabin. He didn't fear dying. He feared leaving her unprotected. Alara let out a broken sound and sank onto the moss, head bowed. The boy stepped toward her and mimed a gesture, touching her forehead gently, brushing her cheek. He couldn't make contact, but the intention reached her. She sobbed harder. "He didn't want to leave me," she whispered. The lantern flared briefly, as if saying, "He didn't leave you? Not really." The boy turned back toward me and lifted both hands again, one pressed to his chest, the other pushing outward. A dual feeling, fear and peace. Struggle and surrender, pain and release. He stepped backward once more, and the ravine beneath him deepened, the shadows stretching into the shape of underwater stillness. The cold of the water rose with it. I wrote. The river pulled him deeper. His lungs burned. His vision blurred. He kicked once twice, then the exhaustion carried him downward. His hand lowered, fingertips grazing the moss. He saw a light above him, soft, blurred, warm, his lantern falling into the water with him. Its flame still dancing for a moment before the river swallowed it. The lantern above us pulsed softly in sympathy, its glow dimming to a gentle hum. The boy's form began to shimmer, not in fear this time, but in remembrance. He crouched, mimicking how his small body had curled inward in those last moments under the river. Cash let out a low, anguished chirp and tried to push forward, as if he could reach the boy and pull him back to the surface himself. The man knelt on the other side of me. He tried, he whispered, he fought. God, he fought. Ilara shook her head, tears running down her face. But the river was too strong. The boy nodded once painfully, slowly. I studied the pencil again, hands shaking. He didn't give up, he didn't stop fighting. But the river was swollen from the storm, hungry and loud and fast. His body gave out before his spirit did. The boy lifted his head and pointed to the center of the circle again. The place where he had first appeared. The place where the truth had waited. I felt a tremor beneath my feet. The stones warmed, the air thickened. The boy straightened, the flickering around him calming into a steadier glow. He lifted his hands, once more shaking, trembling, but purposeful. He showed me the moment the river stopped being water and became memory. At first, it was just a faint shimmer in the air. Then a pull, a soft, steady tug. Not painful, not frightening. A presence, a warmth rising from the earth beneath the water. The moment his body stilled, the river caught him. Not like a predator, like a guardian. The lantern above him flared the same way it flared now. The stones glowed the same carvings now beneath my knees. The river bent and took him. Not away, not downward, not into death, into itself. Into the place keepers go when the world loses someone too soon. I wrote with shaking hands. The river didn't drown him. The river kept him, held him, took what was left of him and stored it in the folds of water where memories settle when they have nowhere else to go. Ilara let out a breath that was half sob, half relief. He wasn't alone. The boy nodded again, eyes shining with a soft gold light. His form grew steadier, brighter around the edges. The ravine memory softened. The cold began to retreat. He stepped toward me, toward the journal, toward the final piece of truth. Now that I had written what happened after, he needed me to write what came next. What he became, why he waited, and what the river needed from me. He pointed at the journal, then at me, then at the lantern. The message clear. Tell the story. Finish it. Set me free. Swallowed hard, wiped my eyes, embraced myself. This was the final part. The part the river could never hold. The part the keeper must speak. The boy stood before me, and for the first time since he appeared, his form didn't flicker. It glowed not brightly, not dramatically, but steadily, like a quiet lantern held between cupped hands. The forests around us seemed to recognize the shift. The shadows softened, easing back into the margins. The air warmed slightly, no longer heavy with dread or grief, but expectant. The moment held its breath. I lifted the pencil again with hands that weren't steady, but were sure. "All right," I whispered. "Show me the rest." The boy nodded. Not shyly, not fearfully. With acceptance. as if he had been waiting decades for this moment, waiting for someone he wanted to say those words. The lantern drifted lower, settling just above his shoulder like a companion. Cash circled once, then laid down beside me with his chin resting on my knee. His tail thumped once, a soft encouragement. The man behind me stepped closer, quiet but present. Alara crossed her arms over her chest, her fingers digging into her sleeves. She was bracing herself. The boy took a deep breath and reached toward the journal. Not touching it, he never touched anything, but his intention moved the air, stirring the edges of the page. The surface rippled as if wind had passed through the fibers. My breath caught. He lifted both hands and placed them over his heart. The lantern brightened. The world shifted. Not into memory this time. Into meaning. The air around him shimmered softly, as if unveiling a story the river had been holding like a sealed envelope. The boy's outlined sharpened hair, skin, clothes, not fully visible, but clearer, more whole. His chest glowed faintly, and I realized it was the same glow I had seen near the river months ago when a stray beam of sunlight hit the water and made it look alive. He wasn't showing me his death anymore. He was showing me what came after, what he had become. I steadied the pencil. The river carried him, not away from the world, but deeper into it, into the current between stories and silence. The boy closed his eyes. His breath slowed. He floated, not in water, but in something softer like memory, shaped into a cradle. The lantern drifted above him in the memory, its glow sinking into the river, embedding itself in the current. I understood. The lantern wasn't just a light. It wasn't just a symbol. It was him. The boy lifted his hands, palmed outward, and then turned them, pushing gently toward his own chest. The gesture repeated once, twice, giving and receiving. He became part of it, Alara whispered, voice cracking. Part of the river. The boy nodded. My breath shook. I wrote. He didn't disappear. He changed. Became current. Became light. Became memory. The river refused to let die. Cash wind, a soft aching sound. I reached down and touched his head. He leaned harder. The boy stepped closer to me, his form warming the air. He pointed to my chest right where the lantern's light had touched me earlier in the night. And I understood. He sang, "The river chose you," the man murmured, just like it chose him. Alara shook her head. Not chose. Recognized. The boy nodded again, stronger this time. I swallowed hard. He was held in the river's memory for years, decades, until the world shaped someone who could finally hear him. Alara, I whispered, voice trembling. Why me? Why not you? She closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet. Because I couldn't bear the truth, she said. I loved him too much to face it. But you, her gaze softened, you loved him without knowing him. You came without fear. You listened even when it hurt. The boy stepped to her side and mimed touching her hand. Alara dropped her head, tears spilling. Forgive me, she whispered. He nodded. A small, pure nod. Then he stepped back to me. The lantern rose higher, illuminating the entire circle. The carvings beneath me brightened, glowing like veins of gold under the moss. Cash stood and pressed himself against my thigh, tail slowly wagging. The boy reached up. His fingers passed through the lantern. And the flame shifted. Grew. Deepened. Not in brightness, but in color. In presence. It pulsed once. Twice. Then split. 2 flames. 2 lights. One stayed in the lantern. The other drifted down. Toward me. My breath hitched. I felt heat bloom in my chest. Not painful, but anchoring. Welcoming. The boy pointed a gun at the flame hovering between us. At me, then at the lantern. My hand shook. You want me to take it? I whispered. He nodded. The air quieted. Even the distant river held still. Cash barked one slow but confident. Alara watched with trembling reverence. The man stepped closer, as if ready to catch me if my body collapsed from the weight of the moment. I lifted my hand slowly. The flame moved closer. I felt warmth first, then weight, then something deeper. A pulse, a beat, a memory, my grandmother's voice, a child's laugh, a river's whisper, the boy's last breath, his fear, his courage, his love. I closed my hand around the flame. It didn't burn, it entered. A soft rush of warmth traveled through my palm, up my arm, across my chest. My breath hitched. The world brightened. My vision blurred. My heartbeat shifted into a steady rhythm that matched the pulse of the lantern's original light. The boy stepped back, and when I looked at him, he wasn't flickering anymore. His form was whole, solid, complete. Alara gasped. The man froze. Cash barked with joy. The boy smiled. Truly smiled. Softly, brightly. I felt tears spill down my cheeks. "Is that what you needed?" I whispered. He nodded. The lantern pulsed once, more soft, final. He stepped to the center of the circle, placed both hands over his heart, then lifted his face toward the sky. His body brightened first around the edges, then through the middle, then fully until he was not a boy anymore, but a lantern of pure gold light. He looked at Alara, at Cash, at the man, and finally, at me, and mouthed, "Thank you." Then he rose, slowly, gently, peacefully, light drifting upward through the trees, joining the stars, becoming part of the sky. Alara fell to her knees, sobbing. The man whispered, "God." Cash sat at my feet, tail sweeping the earth. The lantern lowered into my hands, warm, steady, mine, and the journal's blank page glowed, ready for the last words. The river, distant but present, exhaled. The woods accepted the truth. The keeper's light had found its home. And I, with Cash at my side and the flame inside my chest, became what my grandmother had known I would become. The voice for the stories the river can't hold alone. The clearing was quiet long after the boy's light disappeared into the sky. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask for anything. The kind that simply settles around you, soft and steady, like a blanket pulled over your shoulders after a long night. Cash sat beside me, breathing slow and deep, as if even he understood that something sacred had just happened. The lantern rested in my hands, warm enough to feel alive. Not hot, not pulsing, just steady. A presence. A weight that didn't burden, but anchored. I could feel the new flame settled inside me too, resting low in my chest, humming like a truth finally spoken. Alara wiped her eyes with shaking fingers. She tried 3 times to speak before any sound came out. He's free," she whispered, voice breaking on the word. "After all this time," I nodded. "He's more than free." I looked up at the sky where his light had vanished. "He's finally understood." The man touched my arm, grounding in the way only someone who witnessed everything can be. "And you," he said quietly, "you're not the same anymore." He was right, but it wasn't a warning. It was an understanding. The river had pressed something into me. The boy had entrusted something to me. My grandmother had prepared me without ever saying the words. Cash nudged my hand, as if reminding me I wasn't carrying it alone. Eventually, we walked back toward the cabin. Not quickly, not speaking, just letting the forest breathe around us. The earth felt different under my boots, lighter somehow. Even the shadows seemed softer. When the cabin finally came into view, the lantern flickered gently in my hands, the flame inside it brightening for a moment, almost as if greeting its new home. I set it on the porch railing, and for a second, I could swear it glowed in the exact rhythm of the boy's last smile. Inside, the air was warm, familiar in all the ways that made the nighttime less wide. Cash hopped onto the rug near the hearth, circled twice, and dropped with a sigh. The man sat at the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, staring at the lantern with the kind of reverence that comes only after witnessing the impossible. Ilara lingered at the doorway, her fingers brushing the wood as though feeling the presence of her brother in every grain. "Thank you," she whispered, the words fragile but honest. "For listening." I closed the journal, now filled with the boy's truth from beginning to end. The weight of it felt different, not heavy, just complete. I looked at her. "I'll keep listening," I said. And she nodded, not with sorrow this time, but with trust. Outside, the forest shifted. A breeze swept through the branches, carrying the faintest hum of the river. The sound didn't feel like grief anymore. It felt like memory settling into its rightful place. The lantern glowed. The flame in my chest warmed. Cash lifted his head for a moment, then rested it back on his paws with a soft huff. And I understood something with a clarity that ran straight through the center of me. The river wasn't done. The stories weren't done. This was only the first one that found its voice. My grandmother hadn't left me the cabin because she wanted me to escape the world. She left it because she knew the world would come here quiet, steady, broken in its own ways, looking for someone who could listen, someone who could carry their truth back into the light, someone who wouldn't turn away. I looked at the lantern again, its glow warming the cabin walls, and felt the pulse of the flame inside me answer it. "All right," I whispered into the quiet. "I'm ready." The wood settled. The river listened. The night softened around us. And as the last embers of the day flickered out behind the tree line, I knew the next story would come when it was ready, and I would be here, waiting, guiding, keeping the light. If you want to hear more of these stories, you can stay close. This world grows with every voice that listens, and every time someone follows this path with us, it opens the door for the next lost story to find its way home. So if you want to walk with me into the next mystery, subscribe, stay near the lantern, and come back for the next night the river decides to whisper again. I'll be here, and Cash will too.